This is Dr. Todd May for Lucidity, and it is my pleasure to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Ann Alwis, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Kent. And for those of you who don't know what a senior lecturer is, it's the equivalent of an associate professor. And she's in the Classics and Archaeology department within the University of Kent. And her research specialisms include late antiquity and Byzantium, and also something very interesting called hagiography. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, yes, you did.
Okay, great. Could you say a little bit more about how you got into your research, what it involves, and why someone might benefit from this kind of research, whether it's at the level of academia or just sort of the everyday person who's interested in history?
Well, I started off by doing a degree in classics. And when I wanted to carry on with it, I wanted to stretch myself. And I kind of felt that I had sort of covered everything in my undergraduate degree. And the postgraduate program in late antique and Byzantine studies offered me skills that I hadn't done before, such as the ability to read manuscripts. So it's called Greek paleography. And it's a part of Roman history that is very rarely covered, which is the medieval empire when it became Christian. So really, I was attracted to the unknowingness of it all and the fact that not many people work in it. So there's a scope to sort of be original. And I wouldn't be bored because I'd be learning something new, new
Right.
skills. And in terms of benefit, I think it's the same as anything with the humanities. I think it's being able to think from another person's perspective, from different historical perspectives, and trying to imagine how other people might think and behave. And why the medieval Romans I find more interesting than the classical Romans is that they seem to be more human because you get more of the everyday person as opposed to the elite.
Right.
And it's more about because of Christianity coming in and these people are becoming Christians and then living in different Christian environments. They question themselves, they question what it is to live in this world and how they can relate to their God, whoever their God may be, how they perceive their God. And I find that quite interesting. It's more messy than the classics. The people are more messy.
Recruitment's part of your job, and
Mm,
and you are actually in charge of recruitment for your department.
I am
Uh,
now,
when
yes.
when you speak with parents, is that something you actually mention? Because a lot of times you'll get parents coming up and saying, I don't really know if I want my child studying humanities or something like that. So, and their question basically is, sell me on whether or not this degree is worthwhile. Is that
Yeah.
some cross quite a bit?
Interestingly, no, but definitely when I was growing up, that was definitely the question, and definitely for my parents, what would be the value? What job could you get? So we're quite lucky with the parents we get because universally they tend to be very supportive of their students. But what we do is we show them examples of what our graduates have done, which is usually a mixture of humanities jobs, but the point is transferable skills. The idea of critical thinking, empathy, imagination. And so they work for all sorts of places, our students. And then we also look at, because they like proper data. And so we look at the World Economic Forum and what skills are valued, critical thinking, analysis, empathy, that kind of thing. And we show that the humanities does provide that.
In our generation, there's probably more prevalent the idea that you had to convince parents that a humanities degree was worth doing. I never got that pushback from my parents, although I got it from my grandparents. My mom's father really wanted me to either be an attorney, which my dad was, or to be a doctor, which his son was. My mom was a school teacher, a very good school teacher, but you know, you know that generational bias
Yeah.
or kind of prejudice. Did you encounter that with your parents, and did you
Oh,
say a
for
little
sure.
bit more about that experience?
Yeah, no, for sure. So my parents are Sri Lankan, as I am, and we emigrated when I was a baby. I was only 6 weeks old, but my sister was 11, and we emigrated to England at a time when everything was not peaceful. It was the 70s, so there was a lot of overt racism. And my parents had to become nurses, which they weren't in Sri Lanka. My father used to be a station master in the age of the steam train, but they trained as psychiatric nurses. And my mother loved it. She's a born nurse, but my father hated it. But he stayed with it because that's the only job he could do. That was available to him, and they were nurses until they retired. And my mother eventually ended up leaving psychiatric care and did stroke. She was a stroke nurse at St Thomas's in London. And for them, it was very much, and indeed for the Sri Lankan community, it's very much about prestige and success is linked to money
Mm.
and wealth. And so for them, the five careers were medicine, accountancy, being a doctor, a lawyer, or a dentist. And they were the five choices available to me, really. Because my father kind of said to me, okay, if you want to do English, for example, what would you do with it? And I didn't know because we didn't know anyone who did humanities. No one did. I didn't know anyone, and no one went to university either because they all had jobs. And so I was going to do medicine, and I got into medical school, but I
Wow.
flunked. Yeah, I got into three medical schools, but then I didn't get the grade in maths for my A level, and therefore I ended up doing class 6 through a path called clearing. So my parents and my father particularly was about being careful with money, being able to support yourself, and education is the only way to do that, and having a kind of stable job. And he also liked, because he's a Buddhist, and my mother's Christian, but for him it's about helping others in a very kind of, I'm talking very generically, and he thought medicine was a very good thing to do because you can do good in the world.
I want to come back now to the Christian and the Buddhism and the kinds of, I love talking about virtues. I know the Romans had virtues. I just think it's a great term, but the kinds of values and virtues you drew from that synergy between Christianity and Buddhism, was one more prevalent than the other? Or did one show up in different places than the other?
It's
I'm just
difficult.
curious about how those two mingled.
Yeah, so my mother, she loves church. Notionally, she's a Methodist, and but by the end, she ended up going to the Anglican church. But she wouldn't know the theological differences. For her, it's just a feeling. And she went to church every Sunday and took me and my sister. And my sister, I'm an atheist, but my sister is Christian, and she chose to be baptized when she was 18. I think it's lots of different reasons. But I went along with it, didn't question it. And my father was not again, he wouldn't know the ins and outs of Buddhism, I think. And he didn't go to temple, but he was very, very gentle. And he wouldn't let us kill it. I mean, he ate meat and he cooked. He loved to cook. But for example, the story I always tell about him is that, he found a load of snails in our garden that were eating away at various plants. And he didn't want to kill them, so he put them all in a bag and he got on the bus because we didn't have a car and he took them to the Tooting Common down the road and he would release them all. It's that kind of thing. Um, and he was the kind of person that if you went to the cash point, an ATM, and he found a load of money there one day and he said, I didn't even count it. He just took it into the bank and he returned it. It was somebody else's money. And my mother was very social and empathetic. She would make empathy in the sense of she'd really liked she would be very sympathetic towards people, but she always saw things from her perspective, not theirs, in a sense. She couldn't put herself in their shoes, but she would react sort of. So from them, it's definitely, I don't know which ones you can pick out. I can't think offhand, but I'm sure you could. But from those sort of stories, you get an idea of, and it was also about not being disruptive, to be polite, not to show off. That was a big deal for my
Right.
father.
That's interesting.
Yeah, not to be overly emotional. My father wasn't keen on that, so, didn't like me crying, for example. That's, contain oneself.
Right.
His big things were just forget about it. Got to move on. And also fatalistic. He would say, what can you do? And you just have to move on. So that was his kind of thing. But it was always about helping others if possible, treating people with respect. So in Sri Lanka, when they were growing up, there were servants there. They had servants, and when my dad was courting my mother, he went to her house for the first time, and I think he was offered a drink, and I think he offered it to the servant first or something, which my grandfather thought was a good sign. So my dad was always, don't look down on people as well. So I think I get a lot of stuff. Don't know if I have it, but I noticed it a lot from my parents.
So having to put your mother in a home, you said, was very difficult, but I gather that there probably was not another option given
No,
financial.
No, she was too difficult mentally by that stage.
Okay.
And actually, what's interesting is her generation above, it was about looking after your parents, but now it's come to our generation, it's less atomized actually. Because when I was growing up, it was like the only people we hang out with were our family or extended family or family friends. So every birthday, no matter who it was, you'd all turn up en masse, etc. But with my generation and my cousins and stuff, we're all kind of close because of that thing that happened when we were kids. But we don't do the same things, which is both good and bad because it
Yeah.
can get you claustrophobic. But with the home, my mother, after my father died, because she cared for him because he had a stroke first of all, and then she had a stroke. But he was okay, but he wasn't paralyzed or anything, but he was kind of fragile and he sort of declined. And he had a heart operation as well. He had a stent put in. And so she cared for him by herself. Um, and then she had a stroke, but she got better and she was all right. But that was the start, I think, of her. She has vascular dementia, as a
Right.
result of the stroke.
Okay.
And in the end, ultimately, she's had 3 or 4 strokes, but it was the first or second one that caused it. Then he died. And I mean, that was quite difficult because it was just after my daughter was born. He died. So the funeral was when my daughter was 3 weeks old. So it was, a lot of overlap. Then for 2 years, she lived by herself. And she used the church was massive for her. She would like every day there was a sort of club at the church to which she would go. But we noticed she had a lot of health problems. She was hospitalized a few times, and she was very difficult living by her. She found it very hard to live by herself because my father managed everything, especially financially. And she's not very organized, and so she it was just chaotic. And we tried to get someone to help her, and she didn't want that, or she found problems with it. And I think that was dementia kind of actually would have conspiracy theories about what they were doing.
Right.
And then she started kind of thinking things about my husband. That it was, that he was being weird, and it was all quite awful. And at that stage, we were going to sell our house, and she was going to sell her house, the house we grew up in. And then after the money was divided between me and my sister, we would take our share, buy a bigger house, and she would move in with us. But she never wanted to sell or leave, which I completely understand. It was her home. She had lived in Tooting pretty much all our lives in South London. But by that stage, it would have been impossible for her to live with us because she just was mentally unwell. And I'd taken her so we showed her, so I started looking at homes, first of all, and we chose both my sister and I did. My sister lives in London, and as you know, I live in Canterbury. Near me, just in Whitstable, there's a place called Bradbury Grange, which was a Methodist home. And it seemed really applicable because they had church services and a church group. So she came and for one day or something, or stayed and taught, and she thought it was okay. She kind of knew it was difficult. She knew that she needed to go. And so yeah, she needed to. But it was really difficult. My uncle came from Switzerland, her brother, because he lives in Switzerland. Um, and another relative had died, so people had all come over, and they all went with her to the home, because they all realized that her mind was going,
Yeah.
and so she needed kind of extra care, and they knew how bad we felt. But the problem is, it wasn't always obvious that her mind was going. So some people thought she was all right, so anyway, they all took her there, and yeah, and she ended up in that home. And in the beginning, it was awful because, I went the next day and she was crying and why am I here? And, all this awfulness. It was just so traumatic. But, and I felt guilty. I felt guilty for all the 10 years she was there.
It's very difficult, and I would not pretend to have have any wisdom or insight in this respect. So that's why I wanted to ask you: is there anything that you've learned from this experience, whether something that you wish you'd had known before this happened, or something even a little bit more poignant in the sense of how you see your own life in terms of advanced care if something like this were to happen to you or to your husband or something like that? Any words of insight or wisdom that you might be able to share?
I don't think there's anything that anyone can say that can prepare you. because I think everyone is different, right? So I was in, my mother was in that place for 10 years, and I saw a lot of people there who all had dementia, and sometimes it was all different types. And from what I heard from other friends who've had it, people change. Some people can. My mother was very happy, and essentially she was still happy, but she could become really aggressive and she could become angry, never at me, but at people. And as you say about her being erratic, sometimes you'd think she was normal, and then suddenly something would come out, and you're thinking, "Oh my God!" So it's very hard. And I didn't think about it too much myself, but I did find myself, as time went on, it was a very long time, I would have to mentally brace myself to go in, and I didn't talk to anyone about it, what it was like, because I just couldn't. For myself, honestly, dear God, if I knew it was happening to me, I would get a Dignitas. If it
Right.
was, if it was, I do not want my husband or my daughter to go through that. If it was them, it'd be different. I don't know. Honestly, I
Yeah,
just,
it's interesting that there's a conflict between if it's me, definitely I don't want to be in that situation and burden others. And then, but when you're dealing with a loved one who has it, then it's a bit difficult. And I know that people who are concerned about this, I'm sure they have it in the UK, but in the States they have something called five wishes, where basically it's five wishes about how you want end of life things to go and happen, and this can become a legal document as well, kind of thing. One of the things that I'm interested in, what kind of the mission of Lucidity is to sort of dwell in this area of I don't want to be a burden to other people if this were to happen to me. But the difficulty with that is what you can't often tell when you're going to be sliding in that direction. And so part of our mission is to provide these kinds of benchmarks that people can go back to and say, oh, I remember having this conversation with Todd at Lucidity that if
mm,
this were to happen, it would force me to reconsider. I don't know, something like what Lucidity offers or the five wishes. Do you see that as potentially being a helpful tool to help make these kinds of decisions later in life?
I think so. It's difficult because you don't know what will happen, how you will feel, or how other people will feel at certain. What you may decide now, you don't know what you're going to feel 5 years later, 10 years
Yeah.
later. But I do feel quite adamant that I would not. I mean, I don't, going through it myself, I could, because I know she was never in pain and she wasn't unhappy. But it's not living.
Yeah.
And though she did find she was happy in various things. I mean, it was a really good care home in many ways. But when you think of the people who are left behind, that is the torture. I could not put them through that. And so that would be it would be more protective. Yes, I suppose if this were to, I suppose, yeah, it could be. You could say, decide it amongst yourselves and say, if if I'm diagnosed and if X was to happen, depending on different circumstances, then I guess yes, possibly.
Dr. Ann Alwis, I want to thank you for your time, for your insights, and sharing your life experience and wisdom. And it's been my pleasure having you a guest on Lucidity.
Thank you, Todd.